Vincent Willem van Gogh, March 30, 1853 – July 29, 1890, was a Dutch Post-Impressionist painter who posthumously became one of the most famous and influential figures in Western art history. In a decade, he created about 2,100 artworks, including around 860 oil paintings, most of which date from the last 2 years of his life. They include landscapes, still lifes, portraits and self-portraits, and are characterized by bold colors and dramatic, impulsive, and expressive brushwork that contributed to the foundations of modern art. Not commercially successful, he struggled with severe depression and poverty, eventually leading to his suicide at age 37. Born into an upper-middle-class family, Van Gogh drew as a child and was serious, quiet, and thoughtful. As a young man, he worked as an art dealer, often traveling, but became depressed after he was transferred to London. He turned to religion and spent time as a Protestant missionary in southern Belgium. He drifted in ill health and solitude before taking up painting in 1881, having moved back home with his parents. His younger brother Theo supported him financially. The two kept a long correspondence by letter. His early works, mostly still lives and depictions of peasant laborers, contain few signs of the vivid color that distinguished his later work. In 1886, he moved to Paris, where he met members of the avant-garde, including Émile Bernard and Paul Gauguin, who were reacting against the Impressionist sensibility. As his work developed, he created a new approach to still lives and local landscapes. His paintings grew brighter as he developed a style that became fully realized during his stay in Alès in the south of France in 1888. During this period he broadened his subject matter to include series of olive trees, wheat fields, and sunflowers. Van Gogh suffered from psychotic episodes and delusions, and though he worried about his mental stability, he often neglected his physical health, did not eat properly and drank heavily. His friendship with Gauguin ended after a confrontation with a razor when, in a rage, he severed part of his own left ear. He spent time in psychiatric hospitals, including a period at Saint-Rémy. After he discharged himself and moved to the Auberd's Revue in Auvers-sur-Oise near Paris, he came under the care of the homeopathic Dr. Paul Gachet. His depression persisted, and on July 27, 1890, Van Gogh is believed to have shot himself in the chest with a revolver, dying from his injuries 2 days later. Van Gogh was commercially unsuccessful during his lifetime, and he was considered a madman and a failure. As he only became famous after his suicide, he came to be seen as a misunderstood genius in the public imagination. His reputation grew in the early 20th century as elements of his style came to be incorporated by the Fauve and German Expressionists. He attained widespread critical and commercial success over the ensuing decades, and is remembered as an important but tragic painter whose troubled personality typifies the romantic ideal of the tortured artist. Today, Van Gogh's works are among the world's most expensive paintings to have ever sold, and his legacy is honored by a museum in his name, the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, which holds the world's largest collection of his paintings and drawings. Letters. The most comprehensive primary source on Van Gogh is the correspondence between him and his younger brother, Theo. Their lifelong friendship, and most of what is known of Vincent's thoughts and theories of art, are recorded in the hundreds of letters they exchanged from 1872 until 1890. Theo van Gogh was an art dealer and provided his brother with financial and emotional support as well as access to influential people on the contemporary art scene. Theo kept all of Vincent's letters to him, but Vincent kept only few of the letters he received. After both had died, Theo's widow Jo Bonjour van Gogh arranged for the publication of some of their letters. A few appeared in 1906 and 1913, the majority were published in 1914. Vincent's letters are eloquent and expressive and have been described as having a diary-like intimacy, and read in parts like autobiography. Translator Arnold Pomerans wrote that their publication adds a fresh dimension to the understanding of Van Gogh's artistic achievement, an understanding granted to us by virtually no other painter. There are more than 600 letters from Vincent to Theo and around 40 from Theo to Vincent. There are 22 to his sister Will, 58 to the painter Anthon van Rappard, 22 to Émile Bernard, as well as individual letters to Paul Signac, Paul Gauguin, and the critic Albert Aurier. Some are illustrated with sketches. Many are undated, but art historians have been able to place most in chronological order. Problems in transcription and dating remain, mainly with those posted from Als. While there, Vincent wrote around 200 letters in Dutch, French, and English. There is a gap in the record when he lived in Paris, as the brothers lived together and had no need to correspond. The highly paid contemporary artist Jules Breton was frequently mentioned in Vincent's letters. In 1875 letters to Theo, Vincent mentions he saw Breton, discusses the Breton paintings he saw at a salon, and discusses sending one of Breton's books but only on the condition that it be returned. In a March 1884 letter to Rappard he discusses one of Breton's poems that had inspired one of his own paintings. In 1885 he describes Breton's famous work The Song of the Lark as being fine. In March 1880, roughly midway between these letters, Van Gogh set out on an 80-kilometer trip on foot to meet with Breton in the village of Corrières. However, he was apparently intimidated by Breton's success and or the high wall around his estate. He turned around and returned without making his presence known. It appears Breton was unaware of Van Gogh or his attempted visit. There are no known letters between the two artists, and Van Gogh is not one of the contemporary artists discussed by Breton in his 1891 autobiography Life of an Artist. Life. Early years. Vincent Willem van Gogh was born on March 30, 1853 in Groot-Zundert, in the predominantly Catholic province of North Brabant in the Netherlands. He was the oldest surviving child of Theodorus van Gogh, a minister of the Dutch Reformed Church, and his wife, Anna Cornelia Carbentus. Van Gogh was given the name of his grandfather and of a brother stillborn exactly a year before his birth. Vincent was a common name in the Van Gogh family. The name had been borne by his grandfather, the prominent art dealer Vincent, and a theology graduate at the University of Leiden in 1811. This Vincent had 6 sons, 3 of whom became art dealers, and may have been named after his own great-uncle, a sculptor. Van Gogh's mother came from a prosperous family in The Hague, and his father was the youngest son of a minister. The two met when Anna's younger sister, Cornelia, married Theodorus's older brother Vincent. Van Gogh's parents married in May 1851, and moved to Zundert. His brother Theo was born on May 1, 1857. There was another brother, Cor, and 3 sisters, Elizabeth, Anna, and Wilhelmina. In later life, Van Gogh remained in touch only with Wilhelmina and theology. Van Gogh's mother was a rigid and religious woman who emphasized the importance of family to the point of for those around her. Theodorus's salary as a minister was modest, but the church also supplied the family with a house, a maid, 2 cooks, a gardener, a carriage and horse. His mother Anna instilled in the children a duty to uphold the family's high social position. Van Gogh was a serious and thoughtful child. He was taught at home by his mother and a governess, and in 1860, was sent to the village school. In 1864, he was placed in a boarding school at Zevenbergen, where he felt abandoned, and he campaigned to come home. Instead, in 1866, his parents sent him to the middle school in Tilburg, where he was also deeply unhappy. His interest in art began at a young age. He was encouraged to draw as a child by his mother, and his early drawings are expressive, but do not approach the intensity of his later work. Constant Cornelis Huysmans, who had been a successful artist in Paris, taught the students at Tilburg. His philosophy was to reject technique in favor of capturing the impressions of things, particularly nature, or common objects. Van Gogh's profound unhappiness seems to have overshadowed the lessons, which had little effect. In March 1868, he abruptly returned home. He later wrote that his youth was austere and cold, and sterile. In July 1869, Van Gogh's uncle St. obtained a position for him at the art dealers Goupil and Cie in The Hague. After completing his training in 1873, he was transferred to Goupil's London branch on Southampton Street, and took lodgings at 87 Hackford Road, Stockwell. This was a happy time for Van Gogh. He was successful at work and, at 20, was earning more than his father. Theo's wife, Jo van Gogh Bonjour, later remarked that this was the best year of Vincent's life. He became infatuated with his landlady's daughter, Eugenie Lawyer, but she rejected him after confessing his feelings. She was secretly engaged to a former lodger. He grew more isolated and religiously fervent. His father and uncle arranged a transfer to Paris in 1875, where he became resentful of issues such as the degree to which the art dealers commodified art, and he was dismissed a year later. In April 1876, he returned to England to take unpaid work as a supply teacher in a small boarding school in Ramsgate. When the proprietor moved to Isleworth in Middlesex, Van Gogh went with him. The arrangement was not successful. He left to become a Methodist minister's assistant. His parents had meanwhile moved to Eton. In 1876 he returned home at Christmas for 6 months and took work at a bookshop in Dordrecht. He was unhappy in the position and spent his time doodling or translating passages from the Bible into English, French, and German. He immersed himself in Christianity, and became increasingly pious and monastic. According to his flatmate of the time, Paulus van Gorlitz, Van Gogh ate frugally, avoiding meat. To support his religious conviction and his desire to become a pastor, in 1877, the family sent him to live with his uncle Johannes Stricker, a respected theologian, in Amsterdam. Van Gogh prepared for the University of Amsterdam theology entrance examination. He failed the exam and left his uncle's house in July 1878. He undertook, but also failed, a 3-month course at a Protestant missionary school in Laeken, near Brussels. In January 1879, he took up a post as a missionary at Petit Wasmus in the working class, coal mining district of Borinage in Belgium. To show support for his impoverished congregation, he gave up his comfortable lodgings at a bakery to a homeless person and moved to a small hut, where he slept on straw. His humble living conditions did not endear him to church authorities, who dismissed him for undermining the dignity of the priesthood. He then walked the 75 kilometers to Brussels, returned briefly to Cusmes in the Borinage, but he gave in to pressure from his parents to return home to Eton. He stayed there until around March 1880, which caused concern and frustration for his parents. His father was especially frustrated and advised that his son be committed to the lunatic asylum in Geel. Van Gogh returned to Cusmes in August 1880, where he lodged with a miner until October. He became interested in the people and scenes around him, and he recorded them in drawings after Theo's suggestion that he take up art in earnest. He traveled to Brussels later in the year, to follow Theo's recommendation that he study with the Dutch artist Willem Roelofs, who persuaded him in spite of his dislike of formal schools of art to attend the Académie Royale des Beaux-Arts. He registered at the Academy in November 1880, where he studied anatomy and the standard rules of modeling and perspective. Eton, Drenthe, and The Hague. Van Gogh returned to Eton in April 1881 for an extended stay with his parents. He continued to draw, often using his neighbors as subjects. In August 1881, his recently widowed cousin, Cornelia Key Vos Stricker, daughter of his mother's older sister Wilhelmina and Johannes Stricker, arrived for a visit. He was thrilled and took long walks with her. Key was 7 years older than he was and had an 8-year-old son. Van Gogh surprised everyone by declaring his love to her and proposing marriage. She refused with the words no, nay, never. After Key returned to Amsterdam, Van Gogh went to The Hague to try to sell paintings and to meet with his second cousin, Anton Mauve. Mauve was the successful artist Van Gogh longed to be. Mauve invited him to return in a few months and suggested he spend the intervening time working in charcoal and pastels. Van Gogh returned to Etten and followed this advice. Late in November 1881, Van Gogh wrote a letter to Johannes Stricker, one which he described to Theo as an attack. Within days he left for Amsterdam. Key would not meet him, and her parents wrote that his persistence is disgusting. In despair, he held his left hand in the flame of a lamp, with the words, "Let me see her for as long as I can keep my hand in the flame." He did not recall the event well, but later assumed that his uncle had blown out the flame. Key's father made it clear that her refusal should be heeded and that the two would not marry, largely because of Van Gogh's inability to support himself. Mauve took Van Gogh on as a student and introduced him to watercolor, which he worked on for the next month before returning home for Christmas. He quarreled with his father, refusing to attend church, and left for The Hague. In January 1882, Mauve introduced him to painting in oil and lent him money to set up a studio. Within a month Van Gogh and Mauve fell out, possibly over the viability of drawing from plaster casts. Van Gogh could afford to hire only people from the street as models, a practice of which Mauve seems to have disapproved. In June Van Gogh suffered a bout of gonorrhea and spent 3 weeks in hospital. Soon after, he first painted in oils, bought with money borrowed from Theo. He liked the medium, and he spread the paint liberally, scraping from the canvas and working back with the brush. He wrote that he was surprised at how good the results were. By March 1882, Mauve appeared to have gone cold towards Van Gogh, and he stopped replying to his letters. He had learned of Van Gogh's new domestic arrangement with an alcoholic prostitute, Claesina Maria Seen-Hoornik, and her young daughter. Van Gogh had met Seen towards the end of January 1882, when she had a 5-year-old daughter and was pregnant. She had previously borne 2 children who died, but Van Gogh was unaware of this. On July 2, she gave birth to a baby boy, Willem. When Van Gogh's father discovered the details of their relationship, he put pressure on his son to abandon Seen and her 2 children. Vincent at first defied him, and considered moving the family out of the city, but in late 1883, he left Seen and the children. Poverty may have pushed Seen back into prostitution, the home became less happy and Van Gogh may have felt family life was irreconcilable with his artistic development. Seen gave her daughter to her mother and baby Willem to her brother. Willem remembered visiting Rotterdam when he was about 12, when an uncle tried to persuade Seen to marry to legitimize the child. He believed Van Gogh was his father, but the timing of his birth makes this unlikely. Seen drowned herself in the river Scheldt in 1904. In September 1883, Van Gogh moved to Drenthe in the northern Netherlands. In December, driven by loneliness, he went to live with his parents, then in Nuenen, North Brabant. Emerging artist. Nuenen and Antwerp. Paris. Artistic breakthrough. Als. Gauguin's visit. Hospital in Als. Saint-Remy. Nun. Auvers-sur-Oise. Death. On July 27, 1890, aged 37, Van Gogh is believed to have shot himself in the chest with a 7mm Lefaucheur pinfire revolver. There were no witnesses and he died 30 hours after the incident. The shooting may have taken place in the wheat field in which he had been painting, or in a local barn. The bullet was deflected by a rib and passed through his chest without doing apparent damage to internal organs, probably stopped by his spine. He was able to walk back to the Aubert's Revue, where he was attended to by 2 doctors, but without a surgeon present the bullet could not be removed. The doctors tended to him as well as they could, then left him alone in his room, smoking his pipe. The following morning, Theo rushed to his brother's side, finding him in good spirits. But within hours Vincent's health began to fail, suffering from an untreated infection resulting from the wound. He died in the early hours of July 29. According to Theo, Vincent's last words were, "The sadness will last forever." Van Gogh was buried on July 30, in the municipal cemetery of Auvers-sur-Oise. The funeral was attended by Theo Van Gogh, Andries Bonjour, Charles Laval, Lucien Pissarro, Émile Bernard, Julien Tanguy, and Paul Gachet, among 20 family members, friends, and locals. Theo had been ill, and his health began to decline further after his brother's death. Weak and unable to come to terms with Vincent's absence, he died on January 25, 1891 at Den Dolder and was buried in Utrecht. In 1914, Johanna van Gogh Bonjour had Theo's body exhumed and moved from Utrecht to be reburied alongside Vincent's at Auvers-sur-Oise. There have been numerous debates as to the nature of Van Gogh's illness and its effect on his work, and many retrospective diagnoses have been proposed. The consensus is that Van Gogh had an episodic condition with periods of normal functioning. Perry was the first to suggest bipolar disorder in 1947, and this has been supported by the psychiatrists Hemphill and Bloomer. Biochemist Wilfred Arnold has countered that the symptoms are more consistent with acute intermittent porphyria, noting that the popular link between bipolar disorder and creativity might be spurious. Temporal lobe epilepsy with bouts of depression has also been suggested. Whatever the diagnosis, his condition was likely worsened by malnutrition, overwork, insomnia and alcohol. The gun Van Gogh was reputed to have used was rediscovered in 1965 and was auctioned, on June 19, 2019, as the most famous weapon in art history. The gun sold for €162,500, almost 3 times more than expected. Style and works. Artistic development. Van Gogh drew and painted with watercolors while at school, but only a few examples survive and the authorship of some has been challenged. When he took up art as an adult, he began at an elementary level. In early 1882, his uncle, Cornelis Marinus, owner of a well-known gallery of contemporary art in Amsterdam, asked for drawings of The Hague. Van Gogh's work did not live up to expectations. Marinus offered a second commission, specifying the subject matter in detail, but was again disappointed with the result. Van Gogh persevered. He experimented with lighting in his studio using variable shutters and different drawing materials. For more than a year he worked on single figures, highly elaborate studies in black and white, which at the time gained him only criticism. Later, they were recognized as early masterpieces. In August 1882 Theo gave Vincent money to buy materials for working en plein air. Vincent wrote that he could now go on painting with new vigor. From early 1883 he worked on multi-figure compositions. He had some of them photographed, but when his brother remarked that they lacked liveliness and freshness, he destroyed them and turned to oil painting. Van Gogh turned to well-known Hague School artists like Wijsenbruch and Blommers, and he received technical advice from them as well as from painters like de Bock and van der Wiel, both of the Hague School's second generation. He moved to Nuenen after a short period of time in Drennes and began work on several large paintings but destroyed most of them. The Potato Eaters and its companion pieces are the only ones to have survived. Following a visit to the Rijksmuseum, Van Gogh wrote of his admiration for the quick, economical brushwork of the Dutch masters, especially Rembrandt and Frans Hals. He was aware many of his faults were due to lack of experience and technical expertise, so in November 1885 he traveled to Antwerp and later Paris to learn and develop his skills. Theo criticized the Potato Eaters for its dark palette, which he thought unsuitable for a modern style. During Van Gogh's stay in Paris between 1886 and 1887, he tried to master a new, lighter palette. His portrait of Père Tanguy shows his success with the brighter palette and is evidence of an evolving personal style. Charles Blanc's treatise on color interested him greatly and led him to work with complementary colors. Van Gogh came to believe that the effect of color went beyond the descriptive. He said that color expresses something in itself. According to Hughes, Van Gogh perceived color as having a psychological and moral weight, as exemplified in the garish reds and greens of the Night Café, a work he wanted to express the terrible passions of humanity. Yellow meant the most to him, because it symbolized emotional truth. He used yellow as a symbol for sunlight, life, and God. Van Gogh strove to be a painter of rural life and nature. During his first summer in Alls he used his new palette to paint landscapes and traditional rural life. His belief that a power existed behind the natural led him to try to capture a sense of that power, or the essence of nature in his art, sometimes through the use of symbols. His renditions of the Sower, at first copied from Jean-François Millet, reflect Van Gogh's religious beliefs, the sower as Christ sowing life beneath the hot sun. These were themes and motifs he returned to often to rework and develop. His paintings of flowers are filled with symbolism, but rather than use traditional Christian iconography he made up his own, where life is lived under the sun and work is an allegory of life. In Alls, having gained confidence after painting spring blossoms and learning to capture bright sunlight, he was ready to paint the sower. Van Gogh stayed within what he called the guise of reality and was critical of overly stylized works. He wrote afterwards that the abstraction of Starry Night had gone too far and that reality had receded too far in the background. Hughes describes it as a moment of extreme visionary ecstasy. The stars are in a great whirl, reminiscent of Hokusai's great wave. The movement in the heaven above is reflected by the movement of the cypress on the earth below, and the painter's vision is translated into a thick, emphatic plasma of paint. Between 1885 and his death in 1890, Van Gogh appears to have been building an oeuvre, a collection that reflected his personal vision and could be commercially successful. He was influenced by Blanc's definition of style, that a true painting required optimal use of color, perspective, and brush strokes. Van Gogh applied the word purposeful to paintings he thought he had mastered, as opposed to those he thought of as studies. He painted many series of studies, most of which were still lives, many executed as color experiments or as gifts to friends. The work in Alls contributed considerably to his oeuvre. Those he thought the most important from that time were The Sower, Night Café, Memory of the Garden in Eden and Starry Night. With their broad brush strokes, inventive perspectives, colors, contours, and designs, these paintings represent the style he sought. Major series. Van Gogh's stylistic developments are usually linked to the periods he spent living in different places across Europe. He was inclined to immerse himself in local cultures and lighting conditions, although he maintained a highly individual visual outlook throughout. His evolution as an artist was slow, and he was aware of his painterly limitations. He moved home often, perhaps to expose himself to new visual stimuli, and through exposure develop his technical skill. Art historian Melissa McQuillan believes the moves also reflect later stylistic changes, and that Van Gogh used the moves to avoid conflict, and as a coping mechanism for when the idealistic artist was faced with the realities of his then current situation. Portraits. Self-portraits. Flowers. Cypresses and olives. Orchards. Wheat fields. Reputation and legacy. After Van Gogh's first exhibitions in the late 1880s, his reputation grew steadily among artists, art critics, dealers, and collectors. In 1887, André-Antoine hung Van Goghs alongside works of Georges Seurat and Paul Signac, at the Théâtre Libre in Paris. Some were acquired by Julien Tanguy. In 1889, his work was described in the journal Le Moderniste Illustré by Albert Aurier as characterized by fire, intensity, sunshine. 10 paintings were shown at the Société des Artistes Indépendants, in Brussels in January 1890. French President Marie-Françoise City Carnot was said to have been impressed by Van Gogh's work. After Van Gogh's death, memorial exhibitions were held in Brussels, Paris, The Hague, and Antwerp. His work was shown in several high-profile exhibitions, including 6 works at Les XX. In 1891 there was a retrospective exhibition in Brussels. In 1892, Octave Mirbeau wrote that Van Gogh's suicide was an infinitely sadder loss for art, even though the populace has not crowded to a magnificent funeral, and poor Vincent van Gogh, whose demise means the extinction of a beautiful flame of genius, has gone to his death as obscure and neglected as he lived. Theo died in January 1891, removing Vincent's most vocal and well-connected champion. Theo's widow Johanna van Gogh Bonjour was a Dutch woman in her 20s who had not known either her husband or her brother-in-law very long and who suddenly had to take care of several hundreds of paintings, letters, and drawings, as well as her infant son, Vincent Willem van Gogh. Gauguin was not inclined to offer assistance in promoting Van Gogh's reputation, and Johanna's brother Andries Bonjour also seemed lukewarm about his work. Aurier, one of Van Gogh's earliest supporters among the critics, died of typhoid fever in 1892 at the age of 27. In 1892, Émile Bernard organized a small solo show of Van Gogh's paintings in Paris, and Julien Tanguy exhibited his Van Gogh paintings with several consigned from Johanna van Gogh Bonjour. In April 1894, the Durand Ruel Gallery in Paris agreed to take 10 paintings on consignment from Van Gogh's estate. In 1896, the Fauvist painter Henri Matisse, then an unknown art student, visited John Russell on Belle Isle off Brittany. Russell had been a close friend of Van Gogh. He introduced Matisse to the Dutchman's work, and gave him a Van Gogh drawing. Influenced by Van Gogh, Matisse abandoned his earth-colored palette for bright colors. In Paris in 1901, a large Van Gogh retrospective was held at the Bernheim Jeune Gallery, which excited André Derain and Maurice de Vlaminck, and contributed to the emergence of Fauvism. Important group exhibitions took place with the Sonderbund artists in Cologne in 1912, the Armory Show, New York in 1913, and Berlin in 1914. Henk Bremer was instrumental in teaching and talking about Van Gogh, and introduced Helene Kröller-Müller to Van Gogh's art. She became an avid collector of his work. The early figures in German Expressionism such as Emil Nolde acknowledged a debt to Van Gogh's work. Bremer assisted Jacob Bart de la File, whose catalogue Raisonné l'œuvre de Vincent van Gogh appeared in 1928. Van Gogh's fame reached its first peak in Austria and Germany before World War I, helped by the publication of his letters in 3 volumes in 1914. His letters are expressive and literate, and have been described as among the foremost 19th-century writings of their kind. These began a compelling mythology of Van Gogh as an intense and dedicated painter who suffered for his art and died young. In 1934, the novelist Irving Stone wrote a biographical novel of Van Gogh's life titled Lust for Life, based on Van Gogh's letters to Theo. This novel and the 1956 film further enhanced his fame, especially in the United States where Stone surmised only a few hundred people had heard of Van Gogh prior to his surprise best-selling book. In 1957, Francis Bacon based a series of paintings on reproductions of Van Gogh's The Painter on the Road to Tarascon, the original of which was destroyed during the Second World War. Bacon was inspired by an image he described as haunting, and regarded Van Gogh as an alienated outsider, a position which resonated with him. Bacon identified with Van Gogh's theories of art and quoted lines written to Theo: "Ill painters do not paint things as they are, they paint them as they themselves feel them to be." Van Gogh's works are among the world's most expensive paintings. Those sold for over $100 million include Portrait of Dr. Gachet, Portrait of Joseph Roulin and Irises. The Metropolitan Museum of Art acquired a copy of Wheatfield with Cypresses in 1993 for $57 million by using funds donated by publisher, diplomat, and philanthropist Walter Annenberg. In 2015, El Ali de Ali's camps sold for $66.3 million at Sotheby's, New York, exceeding its reserve of $40 million. Minor Planet 4457 Van Gogh is named in his honor. In October 2022, two activists protesting the effects of the fossil fuel industry on climate change threw a can of tomato soup on Van Gogh's sunflowers in the National Gallery, London, and then glued their hands to the gallery wall. As the painting was covered by glass, it was not damaged. Van Gogh Museum. Van Gogh's nephew and namesake, Vincent Willem van Gogh, inherited the estate after his mother's death in 1925. During the early 1950s he arranged for the publication of a complete edition of the letters presented in 4 volumes and several languages. He then began negotiations with the Dutch government to subsidize a foundation to purchase and house the entire collection. Theo's son participated in planning the project in the hope that the works would be exhibited under the best possible conditions. The project began in 1963, architect Gerrit Rietveld was commissioned to design it, and after his death in 1964 Kisho Kurakawa took charge. Work progressed throughout the 1960s, with 1972 as the target for its grand opening. The Van Gogh Museum opened in the Museumplein in Amsterdam in 1973. It became the second most popular museum in the Netherlands, after the Rijksmuseum, regularly receiving more than 1.5 million visitors a year. In 2015 it had a record 1.9 million. 85% of the visitors come from other countries. Nazi-looted art. During the Nazi period a great number of artworks by Van Gogh changed hands, many of them looted from Jewish collectors who were forced into exile or murdered. Some of these works have disappeared into private collections. Others have since resurfaced in museums, or at auction, or have been reclaimed, often in high-profile lawsuits, by their former owners. The German Lost Art Foundation still lists dozens of missing Van Goghs, and the American Alliance of Museums lists 73 Van Goghs on the Nazi-era provenance Internet portal. References